This Wagner saga in Russia is never going to end, because if this story is true, we are really starting to see the cracks within the Russian military and the Russian government. Right here, as you can say, it says Russia's General Surovikin knew about Prigozhin's plans, New York Times reports. Now, in this story, apparently, a Russian general has been missing since the mutiny, and this Russian general knew about the mutiny and let it happen, so let's get into this. Here's a quick Reuters report on the story.
One of Russia's top generals who allegedly supported last weekend's short-lived rebellion has not been seen in public since Saturday. General Sergei Surovikin, pictured here with President Vladimir Putin, is the deputy commander of Russia's military operations in Ukraine.
That means deputy commander means he is second in charge in Ukrainian operations, which is a massive deal if he turned on Russia.
According to US officials, Surovikin had been sympathetic to the weekend rebellion, but Western intelligence did not know with certainty if he had helped it in any way. A report in the Moscow Times suggests the general has now been arrested. Mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin.
Now, real quick, here's where the confusing part is. U.S. intelligence is saying that he knew about it, but then they say, quote-unquote, Western intelligence doesn't know. That's why it's always confusing, and it's hard to find the sources of the U.S. intelligence who has reported on this, because the New York Times are the ones who actually started this whole story, but we'll get into that later.
Prigozhin shocked the world on Saturday when he launched an armed revolt, bringing his Wagner group fighters to within 125 miles of Moscow before abruptly calling off the uprising. As the rebellion began, Surovikin posted a video on the Telegram messaging app, urging the Wagner fighters to return to their bases as his right hand rested on his rifle. A New York Times report said on Tuesday he had advanced knowledge of the mutiny.
Okay, so what you need to know about this general is that he is second in charge of Ukrainian operations. Now, he used to be first in charge, appointed by Mr. Shoigu, who is in charge of the entire Russian military. So, speculation here, I'm not saying this is true, I'm not saying this is wrong, but the speculation out there is if he did know about the mutiny, it may have been in retaliation for making him second in charge and not first in charge because, you know, to a Russian officer, it is a disgrace and you made him look bad. Publicly posting that now I am second in charge. However, here's where the theory sort of falls apart that he knew about the mutiny with Wagner, because he's also in charge of all of the jets for the Russian military, helicopters, and so as you guys remember, Wagner actually took out some jets and helicopters, and it was a really big deal. In fact, Mr. Prigozhin said it was regrettable in his own words. So that's why this theory doesn't necessarily make sense. If he knew about the mutiny, you would assume that he would not allow some of his fellow Russian comrades to have fallen due to knowing this mutiny. He would have said, hey, stand down, don't scramble these jets, because at the end of the day, it would all fall on his shoulders since he is in command of the jets and helicopters, thus the ones that were taken out by Wagner. Something else that's really odd about this story is that General Surovikin was one of the first ones to go on Telegram and be super public about standing down, Prigozhin, stand down, Wagner. And what you need to realize is that Wagner and this general are actually really good friends. Mr. Prigozhin, head of Wagner, he's in with a lot of the top Russian officials, and he never really talked bad about this general right here. He was talking bad mostly about Mr. Shoigu, the head of the Russian military. That's why we're starting to get reports and some speculation of this is why this general right here, Surovikin, was in on the coup and was okay with the coup happening if it made him in charge since he was friends with Wagner already. Now, like I had mentioned at the beginning of the video, we are starting to see the cracks unfold within the Russian military, the Russian government, because if a top Russian official knew about this, that's a really big deal because we can only assume other Russian officials knew about this. This is the first time that Putin actually felt extremely threatened within his own country. As the report had stated before, Wagner was only 125 miles away from Moscow, and reports came out that Putin actually left Moscow. We don't know if that's true or not, but what we do know is that Wagner was within touching distance of the capital, and they were making a lot of grounds, a lot of influence. There's a lot of people out there saying, oh, this meant nothing, this wasn't a big deal. And they are either ignorant or unaware that Wagner had captured cities with over 1 million people in it. That's a lot of people for a city and a lot of territory to gain. Something else that's obviously being reported is that this general is missing, so obviously that might lead to some evidence that he knew something. But one thing we need to be really careful about is just because we don't see a general publicly doesn't necessarily mean they're in trouble. In fact, when Mr. Shoigu, the head of the Russian military, about 6 or 7 months ago, there was a time where everyone thought that Shoigu got fired because he wasn't made public on national TV for like 30 days. So I wouldn't necessarily say this is true or untrue. You just need to be careful, and just because somebody doesn't appear publicly doesn't mean they're in trouble. I didn't make any YouTube videos all of last month. I was doing totally fine. Everything was good to go. So don't necessarily fall for the public trap. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. Now, the very confusing aspect of this entire story is, how does New York Times have all of this information? Were they like in on a secret meeting with a quote-unquote American officials briefing? As you can see right here in the highlighted portion, the New York Times reported that American officials also said there were signs that other Russian generals also may have supported Prigozhin. Now, the thing is this, they're obviously not going to make their sources public, and as you can see even down here, Reuters could not independently verify, and Reuters is a massive media company. And I'm also seeing other reports that other people can't verify this story to be true. All we know is that New York Times sort of cracked the story because they were getting information from quote-unquote, again, American intelligence sources. Now, if there's one general who's probably feeling it right now, it's this guy right here, the one in charge of the Russian military, Mr. Shoigu. At the beginning of the coup, Prigozhin was going after him. He didn't necessarily say he was going after Putin, but he was going after Shoigu and how incompetent he was. One thing I noticed from the entirety of the story on the narrative from the Western side and American side was that Wagner was here to team up with Ukraine and end the conflict. That's far from the truth. Wagner was here to actually take out Shoigu and to be in charge of the conflict. And a lot of things that I noticed too is that people don't realize that Shoigu is really only there because of President Putin. And if Shoigu is gone, Putin is in really big trouble because Shoigu has sworn allegiance to the Soviet Union and President Putin to recreate the Soviet Union, if you will. So again, that's why I really think that Shoigu right now is under a lot of pressure and stress from the entirety of Russia and his other generals under him to trust him and to actually do these military operations, again, considering he was put on blast publicly all over Russian state television. Every time I think this story is over, it keeps getting crazier and crazier. Now, in my opinion, do I think there had to have been some sort of former knowledge? I do think there had to have been some sort of former knowledge just because of how freely Wagner was moving. It's not like all of a sudden thousands of soldiers are moving on their own and you don't know what they're doing. Like, why are you going back into Russia? Nobody told you to do that. And Prigozhin is pretty mouthy. Like, we can only assume that he was gossiping to other Russian generals who he's friends with. I mean, there were entire Spetsnaz units who were switching over to the Wagner side, and there were other Russian soldiers changing over to Wagner's side. That obviously means that people are not loyal to Putin and are not loyal to this campaign. And we're hoping to fall under Wagner's control and under Mr. Prigozhin's control. And as this depiction shows, it shows here President Putin really can't trust anyone. He's out here on his own. And I really do think he feels that way. I don't think he can trust anyone. Prigozhin was literally like one of his closest friends and allies, and Wagner brings in a lot of money for Russia and Putin, and they were actually making a lot of ground over in Ukraine. They were a feared unit, and they were a good unit, and they used to train the Russian military, but not anymore. So we'll see what happens. Again, every time I think this story is over, I wake up and I see something new. But we'll see what happens. Apparently, Russian generals knew about this. One of them has been missing. One of them might be in jail. The biggest question I have is, how does New York Times have access to all this information? That's what I want to know. Anyway, let me know what you guys think. My name is T-SPLY. Leave your comments and opinions down below, and we'll see you later.